with our goals for today's webinar. Today, in our short time together, I hope that I can help you understand why there is a need for intergenerational mentoring, both in the current context and in terms of the benefits of intergenerational mentoring. I will define what mutual mentoring is and how that's different from maybe more traditional approaches to mentoring or how we currently understand mentoring, and outline the benefits of mutual mentoring and how that, what that brings to an organization different from other mentoring approaches, as well as best practices for how you can develop mutual mentoring relationships within your organization or within your teams. So what I would like to do before we get started is to kind of get a sense of who is here. So if you are identify as a traditionalist or a baby boomer or a Gen X or a millennial, if you could enter how you identify into the chat feature, that will kind of help give us a lay of the land of who's here and what the needs are. And if the years that I have posted there don't exactly click with how you identify, that's okay. If you were born in 1980 and you feel like a millennial, go ahead and put millennial. All right, so millennials. And excellent. Any baby boomers or Gen Xers here?
Right. We have one Gen X and someone from 1944.
All right, excellent. So we've got a nice cross section and every generation represented. So I'm really glad to see that. To me, that reflects that there's a cross-generational interest in what we're talking about today. So that's exciting. So let me give you a little context for why this is a topic that I have focused on. What we are seeing currently in the workforce is a huge influx of millennials. So in 2010, Harvard Business Review reported that in 4 years, which is now 2 years ago, so this stat's a little older, that people born between 1977 and 1997, which is roughly millennials, will account for nearly half of the employees in the world, and in some companies they already constitute a majority. And what we saw happen in 2015 was that millennials actually in the U.S. became the largest segment of the workforce. And so right now in the U.S. workforce, there's about 45 million baby boomers and about 52.7 million Gen Xers. And we have baby boomer or millennials coming in at 53.5 million. So they're currently about 36% of the workforce and will be 46% of the global workforce by 2030. And so these are interesting stats that have come from research by large organizations like Deloitte and Virtuali, as well as some other generational and business experts. And all of them are available in some white papers that I've written that are on my website, tamarathorpe.com, under free stuff. They're also available at the UNM Mentoring Institute website as well. The interesting fact about this large influx of millennials into the workforce is that what we're also seeing is that there are a large number of older workers who are remaining in the workforce. So a few years ago, there was a sense that there would be this sort of large exodus of boomers and traditionalists, and we actually are now seeing a reverse in that trend. So AARP reports that 70% of older workers want to work at least part-time, and that half of them expect to work past the age of 70. And so these are really important stats, because if we think about the youngest baby boomers being in their 50s, we're really seeing that 4 generations in the workplace not only is a current reality, but more than likely the reality in the workplace over the next 10 to 20 years. What we're also seeing that is particularly interesting to me as a leadership expert is that of the millennials who are in the workforce, within the corporate sector, 50% of them are already in positions of leadership. And so I think that's also why we have a good millennial presence at the workshop today, because millennials are finding themselves very early in their career being in leadership positions or taking on leadership roles. And of those 50% in the workforce in leadership positions, 64% report that they feel unprepared to lead, so that there is a need within the workforce to address this skills gap. So the challenges that organizations are seeing today are 2. 1, the multi-generational workforce is a reality, and this isn't necessarily specific to characteristics about millennials. They know there's a lot of hype in the media about how millennials are changing the workforce, and while I believe that to a certain extent there's some truth to that, the reality is one of the key unique features is that we are having 4 generations in the workplace, and that just hasn't happened before. While we are also going through coming out of an economic recession, and also in the golden age of technology. So when we look at all of these factors, there are new challenges that organizations are facing today, not because of the influx of millennials, but because we have 4 generations in the workplace. We're emerging out of a recession, and that is a global phenomenon, as well as in the golden age of technology. And in addition to this large number of millennials into the workforce, a lot of them are coming into leadership positions and not necessarily feeling prepared or equipped to not only lead, but also, and very often, leading people who are older than them. So a lot of the millennial leaders that I work with come to me with questions about how to lead, mentor, and manage direct reports who are older than them. So the approach and strategies that I'm going to share with you today, I hope offer some insight into these phenomena, as well as some approaches we can take to try to close the gaps on working and mentoring across age difference, as well as doing some skill gap and skill building across generations. So before I kick into the next set, are there any questions about anything I've shared so far? That's true. So someone posted, not everybody has to lead, so 36% is okay. That's absolutely true. And leadership, again, also is a really fluid term, right? So whether leadership is determined by your position or role in an organization or your state of mind, that is a difference, and that certainly is a generational difference, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So mentoring today has evolved. And before I talk about that evolution, it's important to note that one of the things that are really important to recognize about millennials, so for those of you who are not a millennial and struggling with the differences between your generation and the millennial generation, here's the good news. Millennials really value inclusion and growth, development, and mentoring. These are really important values to millennials, particularly in the workplace. So when we think about how do we bridge these differences, there are some great values within this generation that we can build on to apply training, development, and mentoring programs, and that's inclusion, growth, development, and mentoring. But like I said, mentoring has evolved. So Dr. Lois Zachary, who's a mentoring expert, has said that the current paradigm for mentoring has evolved. And now, today, the mentee, more than ever before, plays an active role. And the mentor functions as a learning facilitator rather than an authority. And critical reflection and self-direction or self-directed learning really drive the relationship. So we have these really sort of traditional sense ideas about mentoring that, you know, this unseasoned professional works with a more seasoned professional, and there's sort of this empty vessel that we pour information into. But what we are seeing in terms of mentoring is that that hierarchical relationship isn't always as effective as time has changed, organizations have changed, and people have changed. And so there is a need for us to think about mentoring differently. And so we have, some of you may have seen terms like reverse mentoring. And reverse mentoring is a strategy that organizations have implemented where you have newer employees or newer recruits into organizations working with older employees. And this, you know, sometimes or most typically is around areas with technology to try to bridge the technology gap within organizations. There are also, we are seeing much more sophisticated software and mentoring that allows for better matching systems. So larger organizations are investing a lot of money in these mentoring matching systems, making sure that mentors and mentees are matched up really based upon needs and skills, and so that is something that we are seeing as a new trend and part of the evolution of mentoring, as well as web-based mentoring. So there are lots of new businesses and organizations that are mentoring in a virtual context, and so that kids and young people, young professionals are able to connect with mentors all over the world. And so we are seeing this evolution in mentoring, and I think that is important when we are thinking about mentors and thinking about this new approach to mentoring, mutual mentoring. So how do we define mutual mentoring? So mutual mentoring is defined as a non-hierarchical developmental relationship based upon mutual reciprocity between two individuals. So it's important to understand that this is about two people, regardless of age and experience, coming together to share what they know and learn from one another. And an essential component of that is that they enter into that mentoring relationship with mutual respect and a sense of equity, so that they're able to co-create a developmental or mentoring relationship where both participants are mentor and protege. And so that is how I have defined mutual mentoring based upon the research that I have done and how I know it can be implemented successfully. So in order to think about why mutual mentoring is an asset to the organization, it's important to know that mutual mentoring has very specific objectives. The first is knowledge sharing. So when we have people who come into an organization who are new to the organization, and we have people there who have been there for a very long time, there's a lot of knowledge sharing that needs to go on between those folks in terms of institutional practices, institutional values, as well as aspects of the culture and a lot of the institutional wisdom and work that's being done. And the new employees are also bringing in a tremendous amount of new information. So one of the examples I like to use is education. So if you have a new teacher who's coming into a school, and she's going to be entering into a mutual mentoring relationship with a seasoned teacher who's been at the school for 30 years. there is so much that a teacher who's been there for 30 years has to offer in terms of classroom management and how the school works and understanding children and youth development, and all of those are really critical things that a new teacher could benefit from. And on the flip side, new teachers come in having had a very different pedagogical education and learned very different pedagogical approaches to learning and education than teachers who were educated 30 years ago. And so that more recent research and education and training can also be a benefit to a teacher who has been in the school system for a longer period of time. And so that knowledge sharing of their individual sets of knowledge are the primary objective in a mutual mentoring relationship. And then, of course, skill building, right? That knowledge has to translate into skills, so that because, you know, knowledge is great, but until we apply it, it's not really useful. So knowledge sharing, skill building, and then also providing feedback and support within the work environment is essential for feedback and support. And while millennials certainly get lots of criticism for needing constant hand-holding and feedback, the truth is all people within organizations, regardless of age, benefit from feedback and support. And so having that in a mutual mentoring relationship is also a wonderful objective to have. And then new perspectives. I was just having a conversation yesterday with somebody who does similar work to me of the value of being able to see the way that we do things or the way that we have been doing things differently. And so in a mutual mentoring relationship, it affords each person the opportunity to maybe see things from a new perspective. So that doesn't mean that millennials get to come in with all their new ideas and change everything. What it means is perhaps millennials can benefit from seeing that things have been done a certain way for a very long time because it's the best way. Or it means that folks who've been around longer get challenged and questioned about how things have done and if, in fact, it's still the best way to do things. And so that is a reciprocal relationship, and really being able to sort of understand what's happening in an organization and figure out what are the best ways to approach what is happening within organizations and teams. And that goes into and feeds into challenging the status quo. A story that I like to share and probably share with all my clients is the ham story. And very quickly, the ham story was told to me by a mentor, and that his mother-in-law used to always cut the ends off of a ham when she made a ham for the holidays. And so his wife, as a result, always cut the ends off of the ham for the holidays. So one year his wife was cutting off the ends of the ham, and he said to her, "Why do you cut off the ends of the ham?" And she said, "I don't know. My mother always used to cut the ends off of the ham." So when his mother-in-law arrived for dinner and they were serving the ham, he said, "Why did you cut the ends off of the ham?" And she said, "Oh, I never had a pan big enough to hold a full ham." So here you have this practice that gets passed on from generation to generation that may no longer be relevant. And so being able to challenge how and why we do things, and if you guys want, in the chat box, there's a little feature where you can put in laughter. So if that made you laugh, put that in. It'll make me feel good about myself. But being able to challenge the status quo is an important, it's a very important thing for organizations to do. So, so it's a great way to look at how we're doing things and whether or not we need to keep doing those things. And thank you, friends, for the laughter. And then, of course, mutual mentoring, particularly cross-generational mutual mentoring, really allows us to bridge differences and find common values. I have worked in organizations around gender differences, cultural differences, racial and ethnic differences, and now age differences. And it all falls into this category of how do we understand people who are different from us and find a way to bridge those differences, build on commonality, and value what's different. And so those are really important things for organizations to have as part of their organizational culture and their organizational knowledge. Because the reality is, as I shared, 4 generations are in the workplace for the near foreseeable future, if not the next 10, at least 20 years. So this is something that we all have to figure out if we want to be great leaders, if we want to be productive in our work, and if we want our organizations to thrive and be productive. And then, of course, mutual mentoring, an objective for mutual mentoring is networking and building those relationships. And I think all approaches to mentoring have networking built in, and it can be particularly important for young professionals to learn strategies for networking, be connected to people who are going to play a role in their leadership development and their career advancement, as well as for people who've been around to be able to network and get to know people who are new and coming into the organization and going to be future emerging leaders. It's something I see particularly in the service industry, probably more so than a lot of industries where younger professionals are in positions of leadership. And so even for older, more seasoned employees, potentially your career or career advancement is going to be in the hands of someone who is younger than you. And so being able to build those relationships is a critical objective to mentoring. So that is how I define mutual mentoring and the objectives that we want to have driving those mutual mentoring relationships. And when we are able to do that, there are some amazing outcomes that come from successful mutual mentoring relationships. I break them up into 2 areas, and again, all of this information is available in a white paper on my website, so don't worry too much about scratching down notes if you're taking notes, or you can screenshot it, but it's also available in a white paper. I'd like it if you guys were taking notes, but I assume you guys are, for the most part, multitasking. But 2 core areas are cross-training and succession planning. And so these mutual mentoring relationships that are happening, and when they're happening successfully, where there's knowledge sharing and skill development and feedback and support, and all those objectives are being met, what this does is it supports cross-training within an organization so that you have employees at all levels of the organization who understand various roles within the organization. We see this happen in businesses and in offices all the time, where someone gets sick, someone gets injured, or someone suddenly quits, and now there's this huge knowledge and skill gap in the office because a particular person left. If you are engaged in mutual mentoring, it really allows for people within the organization to develop the skills to fulfill multiple roles, and that is so important for organizations and their own sustainability, as well as your productivity. It also increases engagement. One of the things that come up a lot for organizations is how do we retain millennial talent? Engagement is an important part of retention, I think, for all generations, but particularly for this newest generation who sees the workforce quite differently. And what I mean by that is across the generational spectrum, traditionalists and baby boomers are folks who have had opportunities to work with organizations and work for the same institution or business for 20, 30, 40 years. Gen Xers have had a little less of that experience, but certainly Gen Xers ascribe to the belief that you have to stay with an organization for at least 5 to 10 years before moving on. Millennials have a very different perspective in terms of how they view how long they will stay at an organization. Most millennials, and the research has shown, can see themselves staying within a business for at least 2 years. And they've been called job hoppers, they've been called disloyal. But what's really important to note is that millennials came of age and into the workforce at the height of the recession. And not only have they struggled with unemployment and finding jobs, but they also saw their parents, their relatives, and their friends' parents who had been loyal to an organization for 20, 30 years get laid off and lose their jobs. So they don't have the same level of trust and loyalty to organizations that former generations have, because what has happened in terms of the economic crisis have proven that businesses and organizations, in fact, aren't loyal. And so as a result, millennials see how much time they will give to an organization very differently, and how long they stay at an organization is going to be also based on how much value they get back from the organization. And that value will also come in terms of skill development. And so if they are able to grow and build their skill set within an organization, they're far more likely to be engaged and stay within an organization and perform at a higher level. And this way, when everybody is invested in different roles and responsibilities within an organization, everybody as a whole is more invested. We also see great benefits in terms of succession planning. And so we will see over the next 10 to 20 years, traditionalists and baby boomers and Gen Xers slowly moving out of the workforce. And so it will be important that skills are transferred from one generation to another, from one person to the next. And I think that that is very, very important in order for an organization to be sustainable and have that knowledge passed on. I work a lot with businesses who are in science and technology and engineering, and this is a huge problem within the STEM area because a lot of that knowledge transfer and skill transfer isn't happening between the older generation and newer generation of engineers. And it's critical that happens. And so mentoring has become a really critical tool within the organizations, STEM organizations, to help with this transfer of skills and knowledge. It also allows organizations to build a much more competent team and retain that institutional knowledge. It is essential, particularly when we're looking at technology development, to have that institutional knowledge within the organization. And then it, of course, helps the organization prepare and adjust to changes within the organization that are either internally driven or externally driven. And whether that is downsizing or upsizing, whether it's a change in the economy, policy, or practice, organizations that are competent and sharing knowledge and learning from one another and supporting and engaging and keeping that learning and growth going on are far more prepared to adjust and adapt to change when it happens, whether that change is driven by an internal force or an external force. So those are the outcomes and benefits of successful mutual mentoring relationships. So how do you make those mutual mentoring relationships happen? I think there's two key ingredients to making those happen. The first is being able to create and foster an age-friendly work environment, and the second is generational competence. So let me talk a little bit about what each of those mean. So an age-friendly work environment, this isn't about creating an environment where millennials want to come. There's a lot of focus on how do we recruit and retain millennials. But an age-friendly work environment really is about cultivating and nurturing an environment by recruiting, retaining, and engaging workers of all ages. So organizations need to be concerned not just about millennials, but about all the generations represented in their organization and what needs to happen within that organization so that everyone feels as though they're valued and engaged and satisfied by their work. And mutual mentoring can be a really valuable strategy to creating and fostering that age-friendly work environment. And it can because it strengthens organizational intelligence. You can build great communities, sustainable communities of knowledge. It promotes collaboration across difference. And so building that in, right, the mutual mentoring builds in these elements. And so you're able to create an age-friendly environment because the organization is getting stronger, knowledge is being shared, people are learning from one another and learning across difference. It also creates a competitive advantage within an organization. When you're able to level diverse talent within your organization and build on those strengths from different skill sets and perspectives, that gives your business and organization and or team a real competitive edge. And that's important to see, that every generational value or perspective or worldview brings in great value to a team and an organization. And then overall that enhances the organization's performance and then encourages that knowledge transfer that I've talked about, as well as career growth. And career growth is important for everybody. There are plenty of folks who, have potentially been doing the same job for a very long time, but growth is important to them. And so it's important that we look at ways and strategies to do that for people of all ages within an organization, as well as reduce age bias, something I've been quite well known for saying, is that I think age bias is one of the last sort of acceptable forms of discrimination, and that very rarely will people sort of be social, corrected in a social context for saying something negative about someone because they're too young or they're too old. And I think that that is something that we need to be more aware of, and how quickly we might discount someone for their age. And that goes for all ages. Middle-aged folks kind of have it easy. They have a lot more power than older folks and younger folks. And so, there are certainly some commonalities in your disenfranchisement across generations that I think are important to key into, and that the organizations want to make sure they're not giving a larger voice or preference to a particular age group, but that people across the spectrum have fair and equal representation and participation in how organizations and teams are running. And really, to be able to do that requires the second key ingredient that I talked about, which is generational competence. And that is the ability to communicate and behave effectively and appropriately in intergenerational situations based on one's generational knowledge, skills, and attitude. So what that means is we have to have an understanding that generational difference is real, it exists, and we have to understand that those differences are based upon very different influences, and as a result create different values around things that are important to us, like authority and advancement and communication. And so we don't have to fix anybody, right? Like, no one generation is responsible for fixing another generation, just like no one, cultural group is responsible for fixing another cultural group. What we're all responsible for is understanding that these differences are values-based, they're deep differences, and when we have a better understanding of where those differences come from, we're then able to generate increasingly more complex perceptions and experiences of generational differences. So an example I can share with you, last week I was working with a group of millennial leaders who were all in very professional leadership positions within a higher education institution. And we were talking about values around authority and how each generation views authority quite differently. So traditionalists, or the silent generation, acknowledge authority and give respect and reverence to authority just because they're authority. And boomers and Gen Xers respect authority if they believe that that person has earned authority. And millennials have a very different sort of sense of authority and will respect authority if they believe that that person has demonstrated competence to be in that position of authority. And so as a result, what we see in the workplace is millennials are far less likely to adhere to hierarchical structures and far more likely to see themselves as a peer or an equal within an organization, and will often not necessarily follow a chain of command in order to problem solve, collaborate, or get things done. Now, not one single generation is right, it's just different. But what is important to understand is that this is a values difference, and it's important for millennials to understand that boomers, traditionalists, and Gen Xers see this behavior as disrespectful. And that if millennials are able to see that how it's perceived by others, it then gives you an opportunity to have a conversation about how to problem solve, how to work within hierarchy, what's the value of chain of command, and find where there might be some areas for negotiation. And this comes up multi-generational teams. And so it's important for other generations to get that this is the values that millennials are coming from, and they're coming from this place because they were raised by your generation. So traditionalists and boomers and Gen Xers have raised millennials, and you have all told millennials that they are smart and wonderful people who can achieve anything they want, who can be whatever they want, and should ask and demand respect for just being who they are. And that's what they were told. The structures and systems around them supported them believing that, and as a result, they absolutely believe that. So, so this is where we have some values that come into conflict in the workplace. And so it's important to understand that these are value differences, and that if we can accept that and acknowledge that, then that allows us to not judge the behavior, but then have better conversations around the behavior so that we can negotiate those differences and come up with solutions that work for everybody. And then the result is we're more accurately interpreting behavior, we understand the value differences that are influencing the behavior, and then we can make choices, different choices about our own behavior. So when I had this conversation with a group of leaders last week, a couple people had some really big light bulb moments where they were like, I did not realize that my boss was really interpreting this as disrespectful, and that's going to get in the way of me advancing in my career. And so those light bulb moments and really getting these differences is critical, and that's what's going to allow us to develop working relationships where people of all ages can accept differences and be more effective and appropriate across those differences. So I'll share really quickly, because I get asked a lot about differences to bridge and common ground to build on. Millennials seek inclusion, feedback, and validation, more so than any other generation has needed, especially Gen Xers. Gen Xers are very individualistic and seek autonomy in the workplace. And so this is really a gap between those two generations. And baby boomers are more independent and self-reliable, whereas traditionalists really value hierarchy, they value roles, they value authority, they struggle with technology and have very different perspectives on technology than millennials and Gen Xers. And boomers and traditionalists both really believe that hard work is how you earn position. And when I say hard work, don't get me wrong, millennials believe in hard work. But traditionalists and boomers think hard work is something you do for 20 years. Millennials think hard work is something you do for a year or two. So, you know, keep that difference in mind. But here's and so it's important that we understand that these are differences. We really have to find strategies to bridge, and mutual mentoring is a great strategy because it's really the first step in having these cross-generational conversations that help us understand these value differences. And then that common bridge to build on, particularly between millennials and boomers. Millennials and boomers see themselves as really far apart, but you really have a lot in common. Both generations see themselves as agents of change. Both of these generations have a strong work ethic and see growth and development in their work as really important. They don't have as good as a work-life balance as millennials, and so that's potentially something millennials can share with boomers. But also millennials and boomers both grew up in time of war. They grew up in time of recession. They understand what it is to live and adjust and adapt in chaotic times. Gen Xers, we grew up in sort of the golden age of the 80s, and so we have a very different perspective on life-work balance and work. But again, millennials are ambitious, Gen Xers are ambitious, and so using and building on these common grounds really become great foundations for developing those mutual mentoring relationships. And so I'll go through the last couple of slides so we have some time for questions. And so practicing generational competence comes down to sort of these core skills or attitude, skills, and knowledge that we use in the intercultural field, and that's around being able to suspend judgment when we don't understand why people are doing something. Don't judge, but ask questions, watch, observe, listen, be willing to shift your framework and see from multiple interpretations. Behavior. Believe that there is collaborative behavior. Or understand their intention and that's an important conversation to have. And then creating, again, like I said, that common ground. And so one of the ways in which organizations and teams can apply mutual mentoring into their organization is, one, by training people within your organization about mentoring, mutual mentoring, generational differences, and generational competence. It's important in mutual mentoring relationships that there's a needs assessment to figure out where the skills and knowledge transfer needs to happen. It's also important that there is buy-in within the organization all the way from the top to the front line. If people within the organization aren't invested and don't buy into it as a strategy or tool, it's not going to work. It's also important that there's a good matching system, and that's where the needs assessment can be really valuable and sure that evaluation mentoring program within goals are evaluated and monitored over time. So that is it. Up here are our outcomes, so that I hope today in the time that we had together that you have a better understanding of why there's a need for intergenerational mentoring, and that you understand how to define mutual mentoring and how it's different from other mentoring relationships, and that you can really see the benefits and opportunities that come from these type of relationships for teams and organizations, and that through this that you within your teams and organizations can develop some best practices in mutual mentoring. So thank you. I will now open the floor to questions or comments. And I'll just speak to, while you guys are reflecting or typing, Kelly had put in the Q&A that it's a difference around paying dues. And it is very different because they have their been for generations that we saw for lifetime. and themselves living multiple careers over their lifetime and having them more say in their destiny. And so they do see that quite differently. How can one communicate to senior leadership who want to mentor but sees an opportunity to engage rather than teach teach the young ones? That goes to the training, and I think that that is a really important element when you're working with senior leadership teams, of really identifying where there are knowledge and skills gaps within the organization or within the leadership team, and what new talent and emerging talent, how they can help close that gap. So it's the training and the needs assessment. And typically one of the first things that comes up is technology, and if that can be a gateway, let it be a gateway, but I think it's important to not limit what millennials bring to the table. When I surveyed a millennial audience, I got quite a ton of data back. But millennials really see themselves bringing a ton of assets beyond technology in terms of collaboration, processes, systems, communication. These are things that millennials believe that they excel at, that they want to share in mentoring relationships. Fernando asked, I'm starting a mentoring program of 6 interconnected pods, 1 mentor and 2 mentees in each pod. Mentoring is a vertical up-down, horizontal mentor-mentor, mentee-mentee, and oblique mentees from one pod with a mentor from another pod. That sounds very complicated, but potentially quite interesting. And so I'm curious, what do I think it will work? Well, I think it's complicated. I think it could work, and I think when we go back to what I said in terms of setting guidelines and putting in some measures and milestones, I think that that will be really important. So with the pods sitting together and defining roles, defining processes for communication, and setting milestones, I think that will be quite critical, right? The more people you add to a relationship, the more complex it becomes. So defining roles and milestones will determine how successful it will be, and then course correcting as needed along the way. And probably based upon your context and the different roles, you know, I don't see any reason why it couldn't succeed as long as those, you know, important elements and practices to building successful mentoring relationships are in place. Any other comments or questions before we go? Thank you, Fernando, for your question. Thanks, Kelly, for your question. Thank you all for attending. If you have not had a chance to attend the International Mentoring Association Conference or the Mentoring Conference at UNM's Mentoring Institute, I would encourage you to look into both of them. This fall, I will be speaking at the UNM Mentoring Institute Conference. And of course, feel free to connect with me online anywhere. I gave a TED Talk in the fall, so please go ahead and watch that and visit my website for more information about mutual mentoring.